So folks, welcome back. I know more people are going to start jumping in shortly. For those of you who did not join us before, I'm Joe Santana. I'm the chairman of the CDO Power Circle and the host of this program, which is comprised of several expert presenters talking about a variety of topics that are timely and are of interest to people who are ERG leaders as well as DEI leaders. So prior to this, we had Joe, the connection counselor, talking about executive presence. And now we're going to have Jess Osrow, and she is going to talk to you about the way that organizations, ERGs, are evolving, the way that some people are paying their leads, how they're leveraging these organizations, and so forth. So this should be an interesting discussion. I've had Jess on before on the ERG Power Talk podcast. I can tell you she is a no-nonsense, straightforward advocate of ERGs and has a lot of facts and figures. So Jess, I'm going to turn the program over to you now, and we can get started.
Wonderful. And fair warning, my internet has been bumpy all morning. So if I freeze, just somebody unmute and tell me to repeat myself and I will go back. Living in a rural zone is not always the easiest. So I'm going to share my screen and then go into present mode. So if you just give me a second here. Let's see. Let's see here. Joe, if you can just confirm that you can see my screen.
I can see it.
Brilliant. So talking about employee resource groups, facts, figures, discussions about paying leads. I will say there's a Q&A at the end, but if you have a question, I cannot see the chat. Please unmute yourself and jump in. I love questions, all about it. If you disagree with something, love that too. Real time is always better.
Hey, Jess, one of the things that I will bring up is I have the chat open on my end. So if anybody wants to put anything in the chat, I'll mention it to Jess and we'll keep the conversation going that way.
Wonderful. So structure, talking about roles and responsibilities, as budgeting, talking about ERG lead compensation, talking about the state of the ERG. So the report that Joe was mentioning for 2020, 21, and current 2022 stats, engagement, how to drive value to your members, community, the organization, asking you to participate in our survey, and then Q&A. And then I'm going to send this to Joe to send out. And it has like 8 or 9 slides that we're not going to review today for the additional resources so that you all have access to that as well. And then again, please jump in, please ask questions. It always makes it better. And again, more relevant for all of you on the line. So talking about, so here are the core kind of leads, roles, and responsibilities that I see consistently across the board. DEI program manager or a DEI advisory group for the folks that have a DEI program manager, somebody who's kind of the project manager of all this. Oftentimes there's a DEI advisory group, which will be made up of a couple of high-level folks and folks on the ground doing the work so that they can get together and make sure that voices are elevated and advocated at all levels. A DEI committee and or committee member. So oftentimes when organizations are smaller, or they'll have a DEI committee in addition to ERGs, similar purposes often, so they should be working in alignment. Most organizations have like DEI committees of like, if they're larger, like maximum 15 people, and do like a very democratic process, and it turns over every 6 to 9 months. So committee member, employee resource group lead, pretty standard. Each ERG should have at least 1 lead. Most I see have 2 or 3, depending on the size of the ERG. And we'll go into some of the kind of responsibilities. Leadership or executive sponsor, which I know a lot of folks want to talk about today. Communications lead, community lead, events, programming, and treasury. For the ERGs, if they're big enough, oftentimes you want to have a little bit of segmentation in those roles. They want to know who they're liaising with. Really, it's going to be dependent on the size of the organization. There might be other kind of titles or ways to segment out ERG leads. And so depending on what your organization is doing, where your focus is, what their focus is, those lead kind of titles can change and adapt over time. And then talking about ERG members, allies versus identifiers. Ally is somebody who doesn't identify directly with whatever the demographic is of the group, versus identifiers are. So I am not Black, I would not be an identifier with a Black ERG. Some companies have ERGs that aren't specifically identity-based. There are mental health ones there's ones around corporate social responsibility. There's a lot of discussion online about, are those ERGs or are those interest groups? My personal opinion is an ERG should be specific to an identity. Not everybody shares that opinion. I think it's very much still up for debate. And or the key distinction for me is if it's an ERG, you get access to certain budgeting and certain programming versus if it's an interest group, there might be different pieces to that. So just being aware of that for your own organization. Are ERGs defined? Can you tell the difference between an interest group and an ERG, or a community and an ERG? So making sure you have some of that clarification, or making sure you have a lot of that clarification, and you're training folks on that is going to be really important, especially if you as your organization are defining an ERG is in a specific way, also an affinity group or a business BRG. Any thoughts or questions or anything I can dig in further on this piece so far?
Hey, Jess, I have a quick question. In your research, are you seeing that ERGs or some other group that's branched out of ERGs is in some way including non-employees? And the reason why I asked that question is because when you look at the statistics today, the workforce composition is 60% employee, 40% non-employee. The prediction is that in a couple of years, we're going to get almost a 50-50, and who knows, maybe the scales will tip and there'll be more non-employees than employees. There already are in some organizations. So the question then is, are ERGs or some form of group, whether it's an offshoot of an ERG or a new group, are they addressing the need to have an umbrella that covers that broader workforce beyond just those that have the employee label?
Do you mean full-time versus part-time, or like salaried versus hourly? Is that what you're referring to? Or
well, full-time versus part-time, as well as contractors. A lot of organizations have these contractors that work for them who, for all practical purposes, have been there longer than some employees. And that number, according to recent stats, is growing. It's at 40% right now in general in the United States. So I would think that originally when ERGs were established, almost everybody who worked in the company was an employee. So that was a pretty good umbrella for the workforce of that organization to be able to come together, leverage some resources, et cetera. Yep. But as the number of employees becomes a smaller percentage of the overall workforce, and this other group becomes a larger percentage, it's becoming an umbrella that only covers a fewer number of people that make up that workforce. So I was just wondering if you've seen anything in your research that shows that organizations are beginning to address that. And I know that there are all kinds of issues with, with including non-employees and employee type topics, because organizations are afraid of having legal issues, co-employment. I just saw something, by the way, come up here, Jess, that I'll add to this. Nettie Perez says, we call them employee ambassador groups. The structure presented is what we have. We do not include contractors because they're not employees. Okay. And the legal issues that I'm talking about. So in these groups, whether we call them ERGs, whether we call them employee resource groups or employee ambassador groups, or however it is that we call them, is there anything that you see in organizations that's addressing that shift in the workforce?
So I think for that piece, it depends on how embedded the contractor is. I've had organizations I've been at where like contractors might as well be a regular employee. Like they're interacting, they're in all the meetings, they're doing all the things. I've also been involved with other contractors who just have one person they're in touch with and they just do it. And so I think it really depends on that embedded level, as well as what are your rules? What are your expectations? Is a contractor, are they contracted almost like as a salary versus like an hourly? And so thinking about that being said, there's a lot of confusion around how do hourly workers integrate into ERGs? How do folks where you have, someone in the store, how can they be involved in ERGs? So there's a lot of nuances that are showing up that never showed up before because there just wasn't this attention paid to it. And so we're starting to see more questions, more complications. How much time should somebody dedicate? Are they paid for that? What happens if they're hourly versus salaried? There's a little bit more of that in this survey, but that's definitely going to come up in the next survey because it's come up so many times. But really, I think it just is going to depend on what you as an organization want to do. If everybody wants to be involved and you open it up, I think that's awesome. I think, the more people who are learning and growing, the better. That being said, maybe you don't want your contractors involved. I think it really just depends on the organization and, like someone said, defining it and saying, contractors can't, or here's why, and giving that why. And if it's a legality, that's a really easy way to say, nope, you can't do it. Versus if there's not a legality, and I would say that would probably be the strongest point to or not to have someone participate, and or the easiest explanation.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jess. And again, the reason I ask that is because of that shift. And I know the reasons, the legal reasons why organizations don't want to do it, but there are organizations out there that have almost all contractors working for them. And what they do is they start almost like a guild, I guess you would call it, where they bring together all their different contractors, past, present, and people who potentially want to work for them. And they have a separate group. So I don't know if DEI professionals who are answering your survey have begun to think of, hey, you know what? That's a way of doing it, because organizations that do that clearly are communicating that these are not their employees. And you would not say these are an ERG in the traditional sense of an employee group, but they are a group of people that are somehow affiliated with the company, and the company is as a sponsor supporting some type of venue for them to get together. So I wanted to put that out there and let you sort of marinate that as well, because maybe that might be something that we want to start exploring, considering the fact that so many organizations have an increasing number of people that are not employees that are part of their workforce.
But I would also look at what else are those contractors or part-timers or whoever. Are they on your Slack channels or in your Teams channels? Are they going to town halls or other kind of company-wide events? So also looking at what else they are participating in might be a good key indicator of, okay, they're going to want to contribute to the culture, or that's part of when we interviewed them, they mentioned that even though they're a contractor. So looking at the other levels of participation for your contractors, and just again, articulating with them very clearly, hey, we want you attending these, or it's optional for you to attend these, but we'd like it, or don't. And making it clear to them as well, because that's honestly where 90% of the confusion comes in, is they just, nobody's ever communicated whether they should or not. And so they just do it based on their interest or lack thereof.
Absolutely. So folks, Jess is going to continue. And again, I encourage you to go ahead and keep adding comments, your own ideas and thoughts, questions, and so forth in the chat. I'll be monitoring that. And as needed, I'll bring it into the rest of the conversation. So Jess, the floor is yours.
So again, ERG lead expectations. So making very clear, if you don't have an employee resource group charter or have the lead expectations articulated and written out and share it on your intranet, that would be the first thing I would say you need to go and do, or assign, delegate for somebody else to do. I will say there's an organization called Chezi that has a draft of one. I'm sure Joe has a bunch of also resources. So don't reinvent the wheel, find something that's already created and tailor it to your organization. But the standard across the board, behaviors and norms. What are the behaviors and norms of ERG leads? If they're shit talking the company, are they can you remove them? If they're in bad performance standing, can you remove them? Are there term limits? Or, can they go for repeated terms as a lead? If they have multiple identities and they lead one group, can they switch to the other? So thinking about some of these pieces, because the questions will come up and people will want to know what they can and can't do, and just having a very clear outline. It can just be a Google Doc. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but somewhere where everybody can see it. And then I would say, make sure that you have ERG onboarding. So as new employees join your organization and or potentially contractors, depending on what you decide, articulate, hey, we have these ERGs. This is what they do. If you'd like to read more about them, here is that ERG charter. And just linking that so everybody has access from the very beginning they work with your company. They know what the ERGs, they know the expectations. And if they want to read more, they can link to this document. So it can be like literally like a 4-minute training that's all done asynchronously if you have a learning management system or an LMS. Additionally, outlining the responsibilities. Are they in charge of coordinating the meetings? Are they in charge of sending the calendar invites? How many times a week or a month? Who are they updating? Are they, reporting into a head of DEI, or are they reporting into somebody else? Who should they be reporting into? Do they have one-on-ones? Thinking about open or closed meetings or different channels. So Slack channels, and open means ally friendly and closed might be identifier only. A lot of organizations are now questioning back and forth, should we have identity only Slack channels or groups? One, run it by your legal counsel, but two, as far as I'm aware, as long as there's an open meeting where everybody is allowed, it should be fine, because you're not excluding anybody who wants to be involved. It is important to have identity only spaces. There's a great article, which Joe, I will send to you afterwards, that I just read about that, especially for people of color. Those are sacred spaces and should be allowed and should be encouraged. That's going to build camaraderie. That's going to build belonging. That's going to build inclusion. So having both those open and closed channels, and any communication that's done on a company email or company Slack can be monitored if need be. So I would say, don't have somebody from HR in those Slack channels unless they're participating as an identifier or an ally. And if something goes awry, you can always, on the admin side, go back and look at those communications if something comes up or a legality issue comes up. But making sure that those are clear. And to the point before, if you have different leads doing different things, you want to make sure you articulate, what does the events or programming or treasurer person do differently than the community lead, differently than the communications lead. So being really clear with these outline responsibilities of who does what. Again, if you don't know or don't know where to start, Chezzy has great resources. I'm sure Joe has great resources on his website and or other speakers that have recordings. So go to those and start there. Really awesome opportunities to just tailor it to what your organization needs.
Yeah, this is super important what you just covered right now, because a lot of times when groups start, they start because people get together, and more people start to get together and they become larger, but they're shapeless. They don't have clear roles and responsibilities. And so you've got one person that's doing everything. And it's like that old cartoon with the person that's got 15 plates and they're spinning them all. And then you've got a couple of other people that are kind of standing around and saying, oh, this is pretty nice. And they're not involved until that person totally burns out. So having those rules and responsibilities, especially between roles like the sponsor, what do they do versus the lead? Because in some organizations, the sponsor tends to usurp the role of the lead and set an agenda instead of actually being a true sponsor. In other organizations, the sponsor is a figurehead and the lead becomes sponsor and lead. So you want to make sure that we're clear on who does what. It's essentially the basics of a good orchestra, right? What instrument are they playing and when do they come in? When do they go out? And the only thing I'll add is Nettie added something in here too, that back at one of the other organizations that she worked for, they had something called a contractor circle. And that contractor circle was to talk about the workplace, but they were not meeting and convening as an employee group because of co-employment issues. So that contractor circle model, which is probably very similar to what I was talking about before, organizations that have a lot of contractors set up these guilds and so forth, that might be something that we can do. So you can have, just like you have your, let's say, for example, you have your Black ERG, you have your women's ERG, you could have your Black contractor circle. You could have your women's contractor circle. So you can basically mirror those without necessarily having them directly connect. You could probably structure them a little differently, again, to maintain that wall between employee and non-employee, but at least we're not ignoring what is becoming rapidly half of our workforce. So anyway, back to you, Jess.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I would say if someone were to, if tomorrow I were to say, hey, Joe, you're going to be leading this ERG at this organization, here's what you need to do, and you hand them that lead expectation or that charter, Joe should know what to do. You might not know the intricacies of it, but that's how clear this should be of like, okay, I'm supposed to manage this. Okay, I'm supposed to send this calendar invite. Okay, I'm in charge of inviting people. Oh, I'm supposed to create the newsletter. Whatever it is, it should be really clear. The general responsibilities should be the same from group to group. There are going to be nuances no matter what, but having the same number of leads, I recommend, per group, and just saying, okay, if you're a treasurer, this is what the treasurer does no matter which group you're in. So having consistency across that. In terms of the activities and the things we'll do, which we'll talk about in a second a little bit more, that might change from group to group. So talking about the executive sponsor. So to your point, Joe, they should be a member of the highest level leaders in the organization, C-suite, SVP, EVP, VP. Depending on the titles of your organization, you're going to know better, but they should be one of the higher ranking pieces. And it should be said that they are expected to do this. You know, those leadership teams should know that this is a part of their role at your organization. Oh, in here it says ERCs. I copied it from a thing where they call it employee resource communities, not employees resource groups. So apologize for that typo. This person should amplify the collective voice of their respective ERG. So really that thinking about elevating it, making it louder, whatever visual you create in your head, but really how do you say, okay, these are the concerns of this community. They're worried about this. There might not be an action item, but making sure there's awareness at the highest level. Hey, we've published some social media posts that really haven't been, well done according to the Black community. Can we see if we can engage the ERG to, read all copy that relates to any Black voices? It'd be a great way, easy way for there to be amplification. Again, the executive sponsor is supposed to help drive cultural change within the organization based on the group they're supporting. This shows up in a variety of ways. Again, it might not be the same, but you're going to want to articulate it in that charter to say, here are the things, and here's some examples. Here's a way that we've seen an executive sponsor drive cultural change. Not just putting the expectation, but showing some examples of, yes, this works, or no, this doesn't work. In Joe's example, the executive sponsor shouldn't take over the ERG unless something dramatic happens. They're there to be a sponsor, not to be a lead. And so clearly drawing that line in the sand. Attend major events. Obviously, executives are very busy, so they may not join every meeting or every event. They should join at least quarterly, but the lead should go and say, hey, CEO, we need you to attend this event because this is a big one, or we would like you to introduce this event. And so showing up when asked and asking them specifically to say, hey, can you tell me which one of these is most important, or prioritize it for me? So, because we know that they can't go to all of them. Sponsors are crucial to the success. If for no other reason, just that amplification piece and making sure folks feel like their voice is being heard. On engagement surveys, oftentimes it'll say, I feel like my voice is heard. I feel like I have thought, a voice in the decision-making process. I feel like I understand and have transparency into leadership. All of this can be a huge part of those responses increasing and having a positive, higher score on that. And then ideally, although not required, these executives should identify with the group they're sponsoring. That should be, again, an ideal situation. It's not always going to be the case. It also, if you have one Black C-suite or one Black leader, then it's on them always. And so talking to the leader and saying, hey, have you done this before? Do you feel comfortable? Do you feel like you have the bandwidth? Do you feel like you have the emotional energy? Asking those questions, because maybe they don't, and you shouldn't put it on them just because they match the identity. It is ideal, but not mandatory. And then ultimately, what these sponsors should do, they show up when asked, they should provide feedback, support, mentorship, and elevate the voices and opinions of their group. That is core to what's going on. These voices often get shadowed or pushed down. They often get ignored. And so just really providing that extra support and elevation, you've won if you've done that as an executive sponsor. Any thoughts, anything from the chat?
I was just talking with a mute microphone, so that's the only, but anyway, no, I don't see anything in the chat, but I think a couple of things that I want to emphasize that I took away from one of your earlier slides was that role clarity is key to ERG group success. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I asked the question here, but I didn't get any answers, which is, do your ERG sponsors have specific roles and responsibilities? Because a lot of times we'll say, hey, do you want to sponsor this? And people will say yes, but it's unclear exactly what they'll be doing. It's almost like the old joke I used to have when I was working in a corporation. I say, hey, how many of you in this room are DEI champions? And I'd get all the hands up and I'd say, great, what do you do when you're championing? So I know you're doing it. And I'd get a laugh because no one had actually said, this is what you're supposed to be doing, or these are your roles. So you want to make sure that it's concrete so that people know what actions they're taking and how they should take them, when they should take them. And it's evident to everybody that they're doing this, as opposed to just agreeing to be, a supporter from the heart without any external evidence of what they're doing.
1,000%. 1,000%. It should be clear. Show up to one meeting a quarter. Speak at 2 events. Like make it really, really clear. And of course, there's going to be changes. Things are going to happen. There might be differences, but having it articulated allows you to then change as needed. But if you don't have it articulated, it's just, again, yeah, that's a great example, Joe. The other piece is, and I encourage everybody here, if you don't already know, look up the difference between coaching, mentorship, and sponsorship. There are a couple of great blog posts. Coaching is, one-on-one, helping them get better, helping them improve. Mentorship is a different kind of relationship. There's elements of coaching, but it's different. It's usually a higher leader. There's maybe a bigger step, or they're in the organization. And then sponsorship, which is great for the executive sponsor. It's right in the name of saying, we haven't really considered this person. Have we thought about them? That's a great way to, championing somebody who might not normally be heard, or a group that might not normally be heard. It's a great way to do that.
Yeah, Jess, I'm glad you brought that up because I find again and again that people mistake mentorship and coaching. And the way that I usually explain it is that if I mentor you, I'm teaching you what I know. I'm sharing with you what I know. I'm giving you context. I'm giving you experience and all these different things. But if I coach you, I might actually be helping you to develop skills that I don't even have. Like the people who are coaching sports figures can't go out on a basketball court or on a gridiron and do what the players do, but they can coach them to bring out the best in them. So in coaching, I'm helping Jess Osrow become a better version of herself, which may have qualities and capabilities that I don't have. In mentoring, I'm teaching Jess Osrow everything that I know from the experiences I've had so that she has a map of the organization and its culture and so forth. That's an interesting distinction because a lot of times when leaders think that they're coaching, they're just mentoring, and they're not really doing coaching in the sense as a professional coach would do it, or someone who coaches executives or coaches sports players. So that's a good distinction to make so that people know what they're doing and how they're doing it. And a good sponsor should be mentor, coach, advocate, sponsor. They should be all those different things. But again, to your point, they have to be spelled out.
And you could even add the definition of coach is this, according to our company, a definition of a coach is this, a sponsor is this, and a mentor is this, and put that in that charter. We expect our sponsors to do sponsorship, not to be do coaching as it relates to this role. If they do coaching or mentorship or whatever outside, great. They might have other responsibilities where they're doing those things. But again, articulating it, writing it down, making it very clear. Otherwise, you can't benchmark people against it. You can't compare. You can't say, oh, did they do it right? Yes or no. So that having that clarity is going to be big.
Yeah. And as we were talking, Nettie added in the chat area that their sponsors review their group strategies quarterly and they provide business input. And they're also charged with advocating and speaking and hosting major events for these groups. So there's some specificity built around what it is that they're supposed to do. And these could be different in different organizations. To your point, they could
share best practices. Yeah. Don't reinvent the wheel. If Nettie already has a great template, like drop that in the chat, ask your peers at other organizations what theirs look like, because there is no harm in saying, I'm just going to take that. That's a great, I love that definition. I love that bullet point. I love that expectation. Run with it.
Exactly.
Cool. So this next slide, or the next two slides, active versus community focused ERGs. This is a newer kind of concept that I've been hearing about and coaching and supporting. Again, ERCs versus ERGs is a copy actually from the charter that I for a company that I consult with. ERGs are naturally going to have different levels of participation. They should all have goals, but by having the differentiation of active or community focused, or again, whatever labels you choose, it might differentiate the budget and other pieces. So as we go along, I'll kind of talk about the nuances. But thinking as an active ERG, they're going to set more ambitious goals. They're going to have a track record of making significant progress on achieving these goals. They're going to have more meetings, more, whether monthly or bi-monthly, ally only or ally friendly or only identifier only. They're going to be doing things more rapidly and at a faster pace. Some examples: hold monthly meetings for both groups, share a monthly newsletter, sponsoring identifier related speakers for the entire workplace, creating a scholarship, doing, there's a whole bunch of different initiatives, but it's active. Maybe they have one goal a quarter to complete versus one goal a year. So some groups often that I see that are very, very active are often LGBTQIA, often Black culture, and often Asian AAPI. That is not a hard and fast rule. Those are just the groups that tend to be more active. And on the flip side, community focused, are often, I don't want to say softer. And I have previously used the word passive, and that is not the right term either, but they're there to be that community, to be a group. I often see this in parents or disability related ERGs, groups that may not have the energy or the ability to do as much as those active groups, but still want to have the community, still want to have the support. And so instead of monthly meetings, it may be bi-monthly or quarterly. Instead of a monthly newsletter, it's a quarterly newsletter. And a great example from when I worked at an organization is the parents ERG said, hey parents, you can reimburse up to $15 worth of ice cream. You just got to take a picture of you eating the ice cream with your kids and send it to us, and we're going to share it in the newsletter. And that was one of the company's favorite newsletters. It's just all these happy kids and their parents eating ice cream. And so it was just a really simple way where, the parent didn't have to stay after, they don't have to attend an event. There's not extra work. It's just allowing them to spend time with their family, but it's a great initiative. Another one is the parents group, working with other groups, specifically Black Culture API, about expensing a book on racism, a children's book related to racism. And so providing a bunch of books and saying, hey, if you show the receipt, we'll reimburse you for a child in your life, whether you're a parent or not, up to whatever it was, $15 for a book about racism, so that younger folks can learn about it. So thinking about ways that they can impact their community without necessarily expending as much energy as some other groups do. So thinking about these different groups and how they're going to contribute, how their goals might be different. It's awesome when groups are different, but they should still have expectations. And so you might say an active group has 5 goals a year, a community focus group should have 3, or whatever it may be, but allowing that, creating that space for that differentiator depending on the identity of the group. Any thoughts?
Yeah, you're good on my end. No other comments here.
Cool. We're going to jump into budgets. So if you have ERGs, you need to have an ERG budget, period, end of story. If that budget is $1, get that line item in. You can always improve it. If it's the first time asking for a budget, again, get that one line item in. It can be small. Getting something in, you can always grow it year after year. If you're updating or revising a budget, you want to make sure it's segmented out, just like any other piece. Also, your finance team will probably love you because they need to have things segmented out. And so if you're thinking about budget, what previous spend can be reallocated. Oftentimes it's like, okay, well, we budgeted this under L&D, but really it's DEI, or, HR has this, but they didn't spend it last year. Maybe we can reallocate it because it's, wasn't spent. Thinking about departmental responsibility versus, is there a DEI department? And within that, is there an ERG allocation, or is ERG allocation completely separate? And so is it kind of a sub budget or part of a larger budget? And then what are those goals and expectations? And what financial means might be needed to achieve them? And this is where companies often grit their teeth and say, crap, we missed this one. If you're asking your ERGs to set goals, you need to fund them. You need to be able to give them, just like anything else in the organization. It might be about education, it might be training, it might be books or ice cream, but giving them access to funds is expected at this point. And if you're not, again, get that line item, get that budget, get started. You can always make it bigger. And I'm going to talk about some money here and there in the addendum, but just get started. Why you do this, brings clarity to how the money is being spent. You can connect that money directly to outcomes and goals. It creates some transparency in the spend process. Oftentimes folks who are leading ERGs aren't always aware of expense processes or, budgeting. Maybe they've never done a budget before. By giving them access and saying, hey, your ERG is $10,000 for the year, you're helping them build budgeting skills. And so it's also a great way to help folks build skills and or get insight and or meet new people. Maybe they never met the finance team and now they meet quarterly with the finance team to review the budget. It's a great way to build connection and a great way to build skills. And delegate it down. The highest person doesn't have to do it. Once it's there, say, okay, you're the finance person who does it, and you're the, the treasurer. All the treasurers meet monthly to just review. Budgeting also allows you to compare and contrast from other ERGs, and we're going to go into that a little bit more. And how money does or does not contribute to the achievement of goals. Maybe the money is just purely just to get community. Maybe everybody wants to buy swag and it doesn't achieve any goal. If that's the case, and you're like, well, we don't really need more swag, so we're actually going to say your budget can't do swag. So you can also give budgets that kind of structure and say you need to directly correlate it with a goal or whatnot, or so on and so forth. So you can set some guidelines. Additionally, adding that clarity in that charter, there should be a section on ERG budgets so that folks know. And every time a question is asked, edit that document. I always say our ERG charters are like 95% solid, but there's 5% that's living and things might be updated. And as there are big updates, they'll be shared and just say, hey folks, update here, be sure to check it out. And that way there's transparency. It doesn't mean a glass window. You don't have to look through it, but that everybody has access to the document.
One of the things I'll add to that with the budgets is I usually recommend that groups look for somebody who's already in the finance organization to act as their treasurer, because they already understand the accounting system for that company. And they're also able to, in many cases, help calculate the ROI using formulas that already have credibility. in the organization because they're presented by somebody who's actually doing the financials for the organization's business. The other thing that I wanted to mention real quick is that in the previous slide that you had where you were talking about community versus active, another way of saying it is goal focus versus support focus. It's basically the same concept, but the wording is different. Instead of goal active versus community active, they use this other model of you're doing something to support the community or you're doing something to achieve a particular goal. And then to that, Nettie added that in their official budget, they basically allocate a certain amount of money for different types of activities that may fall under goal or community. So for example, there's a certain amount for community relations, a certain amount for other types of projects and so forth.
I love that. And just adding that clarity and distinction is great. That's the key there. So going to talk quickly about is segmenting the budget in like two different ways that I like to do it. The first one is the 4 C's. And if you Google ERG 4 C's, you'll get a ton of visuals. I am terrible at citations and names, but it is this is a known process. So career and community are 2 of the 4 C's. So career, about enhancing the employee's career. What is currently being done for professional development? How can ERG support the professional development or L&D department? Do they need to spend money to do that, or should that be L&D? But really thinking, how can they support current initiatives? ERGs are great at coming in and saying, instead of saying, hey, we want to do this, hey, what is this department doing and how can we support it and push it and grow it? Again, thinking about company goals. For community, how do they impact the communities they serve? This can be internal community, which is often a different sea of culture, but the external community, thinking about your customers, thinking about your consumers, thinking about who's buying your product, thinking about who should buy your product. Is there a CSR strategy, a corporate social responsibility strategy? Are there any other groups, communities? I have a typo in there. Are there any other similar groups, or maybe you have an ERGs or a group that's considered an ERG now that's doing similar programming? Are volunteer initiatives already happening? Donations, scholarships? There's a lot of different ways that you can do community, and the ERGs are great. That's a great thing to say, hey, we want to do some corporate social responsibility. We have $30,000 for it. We would love you to propose some ideas. That's a fabulous way to delegate down some resources and say, we're going to do this and we're going to take your opinions into place.
And before you move on with the 4 C's, that's Dr. Robert Rodriguez, the 4 C's of ERGs. I interviewed him many years ago for an article when he first developed this model. And it's a good way to segment your budget. So look that up, 4 C's of ERGs by Robert Rodriguez. And got a couple of other comments here, reading real quick between 2 comments that I got here. So it looks like the amount of money that some of the organizations are allocating to these groups are in the 5K range, a little above, or maybe right there on that area. So don't know how that compares to some of the stuff that you found in your survey, but that's what I'm getting back here in the chat. Jess, I can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Welcome to Zoom. I'm muted, 2 years in. That I don't believe I have that data in this presentation, but I can always, when I'm not presenting, can bring up the survey and give current stats. But that will be in the report, which will be free access for everybody. Everybody's going to get sent it out who wants access to it. Last year's, if you go to the Rise Journey and our blog, you can see the reports from the last 2 years. And so we will be reporting on budget size for individual ERGs, as well as if there's an ERG collective budget, as well as for DEI committees for those smaller organizations. We will be cross-referencing it against company size. Last year, there was no correlation between company size and ERG budget or DEI committee budget, which I thought was super interesting. You can come. But we're going to be reporting on that, and that's again why I want more survey respondents, so we can have a wider range of data to report on. I will say this year we have a much larger pool of larger companies, so those who have more than 5,000 people. So we're able to report better data on that this time around. As for other C's, commerce and culture. So commerce, leveraging ERGs for business impact. So thinking about how are you involving your ERGs in tech and product or other business focused units such as marketing, real social media. Sorry, noise in the background. How can you get your ERGs to support getting additional customers, additional buyers? Thinking how you can leverage your ERGs to make more money at the end of the line. Diversity is a business initiative. Use your ERGs, use your diversity to impact positively your business. And if you don't ask them, start small. Say, hey, can you look over this copy for this thing? Can you look over the screen and make sure it's inclusive for those who, don't identify with the gender binary? Whatever it is, bring them in, ask their opinion. They will be honored and they will work on it, and they will be the hardest and most loyal folks when you get that, and they get asked for those opinions. And so raising cross-cultural competence. This can also be about internal culture, a lot of different ways to interpret these. So thinking about the intersection of learning and development, DEI and HR, thinking about who has previously been responsible for these, again, with dividing, and segmenting pieces, is HR in charge of L&D, or is L&D its own piece? Or should the ERG support a currently existing organization? Or are you asking them to do something else? Where do they have to partner versus starting from scratch? So helping create those connections and, thinking of it as like a web, that it is all connected. And so just creating those pathways so folks can more easily access. The other way I like thinking about it, and it's very similar to the 4 Cs, is using pillars, different language. So thinking about tech, product, and consumer, again, bringing them in to support the technical side, the product side, and the consumer side, helping create new audiences and expand potential revenues. Brand and recruitment, so bringing in that recruitment piece, having representatives from ERGs when rebranding, updating values, changing core parts of the organization, how it looks, feels, runs, thinking about your careers page, how your ERGs are represented on that. Do you have like an ERG blog that people can read? Do people have an option who are interviewing to interview with or have like coffee with someone from an ERG? So thinking about how you can bring them in, their perspectives are powerful. And as a white person, I'm never going to have the perspective of a person of color, thinking about those things. So if there is somebody, making sure that they know they have access, and don't just say it at the end, say, oh, actually, during this whole process, if you want to meet with somebody from ERG, all you have to do is ask and we'll make a connection. So making sure people know from the get-go, maybe even on your careers page, you say, this is part of our interview process if you want it, making it very clear. And then on the other side, going to your ERGs and say, hey, we want to offer this. Are you on board for this? Yes, great. This is how you can help out. Do you have a pool of people that we can pull from if there's somebody wants to interview, so that way we don't have just one person, that one Black person who's talking to 1,800 candidates. We have a number of different people who can talk to candidates and be interview trained and all of those kinds of things. This is a particularly powerful brand and recruitment piece to use ERGs on. And then internal culture, don't think of it as just in celebrations. This month is Pride, and Juneteenth was Sunday. This isn't just about those things, but it is including those things. So thinking about providing equitable support and offerings. When you look at your benefits package, do you offer parental leave versus maternity or paternity leave? Are you offering gender reassignment support? Do you offer stipends? What about egg freezing? What about, mental health? So thinking about other forms of benefits. And if you think, hey, we actually don't have any benefits that we know of that support this community, go to that community and say, what would be helpful? You might already have it. Maybe it's just hidden, benefits get hidden away and they get lost. So have the ERGs do audits and helping you, as well as specifically thinking about, are you paying people equitably? Wow, words today. If you haven't done a compensation audit, whether internal or with a consultant, you should. You should know if you're paying Black women the same as white women, the same as white men, if they're in comparable roles. If you don't have levels or competencies that are associated with a salary band, it's time to do it. All of this goes in together, and I know I'm going off a little bit, but this is about equitable culture and equitable organizations. ERG is a part of that. An ERG is going to be very loud about these things if they aren't happening or there isn't known processes in place. Again, internal culture can be a very expansive category. It's often where other groups will intersect very often, is on this internal culture piece. And then learning and development. Again, whether you have somebody formally in an L&D role or not, letting the ERGs know what your expectations of them are. And this is part of the goals. Hey, we expect each ERG to host 2 L&D events a year because we don't have an L&D department. And we're going to give you budget for that, just like you would if you have an L&D person. So thinking about that. So again, or if you have an L&D person and they're rolling out certain programming, bring in your ERGs to help roll that out, get that buy-in so that it's not just a pebble rolling down the hill, but you have a boulder from the get-go creating momentum. ERG leads and participants are great champions. They're great to say, oh, have you checked this out? Oh, here's a link. Oh, this, that, and the other thing. So if you bring them on board early and often, it's only going to enrich your culture.
What I was going to add too, Jess, is that L&D in many cases in organizations, does not address all the needs of all the people, especially people that are underrepresented. And I remember from my own experience years ago when I was a line executive, and there was a majority of men that worked in the tech space. When women started coming into the organization and they started coming in through a different channel than most of the men were coming in, most of the L&D programs were not designed to help the women develop their skills to become leaders. They were designed to teach men soft skills and to teach them some of the other skills that the women already had. So even if you included the women in the existing program, it wasn't going to benefit them because it wasn't going to give them something they needed. It was going to give them something they already had, but it wasn't going to give them the dimensions that they needed. So we need to be aware of the fact that our L&D programs in our organizations were built with a certain type of person in mind, a certain employee. Think of it as when someone goes to college in their first year of college, the expectation of the college professor is you graduated from high school and you already know all these basic things, and we're going to start from here. But when you have an organization where people are coming in from different backgrounds and different experiences, the program that may be effective in the majority culture may not necessarily address all the needs of all the other underrepresented cultures. And that's one of the things that I know in some organizations that ERGs address. And then later on, some segments of what the ERGs start then become part of the L&D program. So I know in a couple of organizations where L&D actually has tapped on the ERGs to build their suite of programs to make them more effective with a broader, more diverse spectrum of employees.
In my previous organization, I was head of L&D and DEI. And one of the things, the best things I did was delegate folks from the ERGs to support me in building out lessons in our LMS and our learning specifically about ERGs. But also what I found is we had a lot of folks who were over the age of 40 who hadn't had a lot of use of Slack, the communication tool Slack. And so I said, hey, we use Slack endlessly. People are coming into the organization and they aren't, who normally would join an ERG and aren't. Let's train them. And so we did, again, all async, created a not training, we'd met and built it out, but the actual training itself was async, and it was something they got within their first week. And we had a 90% increase in folks joining our ERG Slack channels within their first 2 weeks of hiring or being hired. So you can track those numbers, you can see and test it out and see based on how many people are joining. And the other piece is L&D being distributed equitably. If you have a professional development budget or stipend, are Black people using it as much as white people? Are Latinx, are women, are this or that? So tracking these pieces, ERGs can also support in that if you bring them in, and making sure that the services you are providing to your organization are being used equitably. And that's a big thing, because I've always found that white people use money first. Black people always need extra encouragement. In my experience in L&D, that has been almost the rule every time. And so for me, going into these ERGs and talking about what L&D opportunities there are was a great way for me to promote and say, hey, here's things you didn't even know you could take advantage of. And that was a way I increased the usage across the board to be more equitable. And again, how they can integrate in.
Yeah, great point.
And then budget allocation, a couple of different ways to think about it. A lump sum. ERGs, we have 4 ERGs and there's going to be 20,000, so 5,000 each. Or actually, we want to make the spend per ERG. Or we're actually going to build it out thinking it's $20 per head. What does that talk? And so work backwards, and I'm going to show some math, some really basic math in a second. But thinking about what are their goals? And, maybe you need to bring in 5 external speakers. What are those speaker costs? If those speaker costs are $2,000 each, there's $10,000 of that $20,000 budget. Maybe you need a higher budget, or you need to say specifically for speakers, we're setting aside this budget, and for everything else, we're setting aside this budget. Those more community driven, or, I forget what the other person in the chat mentioned. For those more community-driven ERGs, I often say they're going to use less budget. So thinking about a minimum and a maximum spend. Each ERGs can spend a maximum of $6,000, even if there's only out $5,000 allocated to them. But they have to spend a minimum of 2, because those like less active ERGs or more community-driven ERGs are probably going to have less spend. So giving room for other ERGs to take advantage of that funding can be helpful. And then again, really basic math, if you allocate $10 per employee per month and you have 123 employees, I think that in 12 months, hopefully my math works out there, $15,000 a year, that's pretty small budget. Like that should be your minimum, is $10 per employee per month in terms of spend. And I did $50, not $25. Oops, math. So this go by the chart number here. If you have the same thing, 123 employees and you spend $50, it's under 73,000, 74,000. When you think about the average cost for an engineer, which according to built-in was 128,000, considering this is for your entire organization and multiple ERGs potentially, for 80, spending $50 a head is, less than one employee cost. And that's not even including, healthcare costs and other costs that employees have. I tend to try to steer away from that per ERG model. You can have, again, those minimums and maximums. We want them to spend at least $2,000 on internal culture related expenses, but maximum of this. And that really allows, again, some flexibility and some wiggle room based on the needs. Any thoughts or questions? I often suggest doing the per employee per month because that's how a lot of software is purchased. SaaS software, software as a service software, a lot of S's, is done per head. And so it's easier conceptually, math-wise, to say, okay, if we have X number of employees, how much do we want to spend on it? Versus just saying, why don't we do $100,000? And if you're like, well, how'd you get that number? And you're like, I made it up. This allows a little bit more texture to it. The thing that isn't represented here is maybe you have 123 employees now, but by the end of the year, you're going to double. So you should be planning based on 246 employees, not 123 employees. Or if you say, if you really want to get complicated on math, you can say, okay, we have 123 in January. By, June, we're going to have 182. And so we're going to only do $25 because it's the second half of the year versus $50. If you want to get complicated, go for it. I'm all about the complication. I love me a good Excel formula, but this is a great way for people to just conceptualize the per head model.
That's a great model. I don't see any comments on this end in terms of that. You might have heard me laugh in the background when you said, we just pulled that number out of the air.
And I do that. I am the most guilty of being like, let's put 200,000 toward it. And people are like, why? And I'm like, because that sounds like a good number. You have to set a stake somewhere sometimes. So I know what you mean.
I like the idea of using, what did you say, the cost of software? The average cost of software? That's an excellent way to put it, because I would guarantee you I hate to generalize, but a lot of D&I practitioners probably, to your point, just use a broad number. I know I've been guilty of it in the past, but that's an excellent way to look at it. That $10 per employee, I love that idea. So thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, just piggybacking on what Antoine just said, anytime that you can use a known model or a known process, especially one that's known to senior leaders, to explain something, all the better. It's almost like the movie producer who's trying to push a new movie and goes to the funders and says, look, this movie is going to be like Top Gun, but it's underwater. You're using something that they know to connect their thinking to something that may not be as familiar. You might talk about how your DEI efforts are going to help the organization to strengthen its ability using like a SWOT model that a lot of marketing people and executives use: strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. The more you learn models like that are maybe not from the DEI space, but from the business space, from the software space, and from other areas that are familiar within your organization to talk about this topic, the easier you make it for other people to understand it and appreciate it.
Yes.
No, I have to text my co-founder and let her know I'm running a half hour late because we scheduled this over. So just give me 1 second to text.
In filling in time for Jess, because Jess said it perfectly. I don't know if she said it exactly like this, but ERGs or D&I, DEI, they should be an integrated business practice.
Yes.
Right. So to your point, Joe, all of the business practices or models that you use in the typical traditional businesses, you should use here as well.
That's correct.
So, right. It's not I like to say D&I is not a policy, right? It's an integrated business practice. And Jess said that earlier perfectly. So good point.
Yeah, if the business doesn't exist, DEI in the business isn't going to exist. And I would say every ERG goal should tie somehow to a business goal. In consulting work that I do in this, when we do engagement survey audits, one of the things we do as part of our listening tours, we say, what's your 5-year plan as a business? what do you want to achieve? What are your goals? Is it to make $1 million or get 1 million new users? And we build that into our DEI strategy that we're recommending to them based on those, so that an ERG could just pick up a piece of it and say, okay, here's how we're going to contribute. And you can then track it and, waterfall it up to one of those top line goals that an organization has. If you have Lattice or Culture Amp or something else where you're putting goals in a system, and I don't talk about ERG goals today. If you want to talk about ERG goals, Joe will share my booking link. I can nerd out about ERGs all day long. They should all connect back to the goals of the organization. And some of that, the culture ones are about retention. We want to create, we have 16 months as our average retention. We want to up it to 18 months. Internal culture can relate to that. But I'm going to keep going because I have more slides. So thinking about budget tracking, these are just the two basic ways, like a matrix and a pivot table. If you're not an Excel champion, if you are an Excel champion, these might seem super basic. If you're not a super Excel or math-oriented person, these are great ways of just automating some pieces and putting it in the system. So looking at via the 4 pillars, ERG 1, 2, 3, here's what they're spending. And so you see the average per ERG or the amount per ERG, but also the amount per pillar. So you can say, oh, we're really overspending in culture, but not really in commerce. But we only have 1 commerce goal and we have 15 culture goals. So that makes sense. So you can start to see and, keep track as you go versus doing a postmortem at the end of the year and say, oh my God, we messed up. We committed all of our money here when we should have done it over here. You can keep track live of what's going on.
This is another area, Jess, where your treasurer can help you, because this is their bread and butter, is doing charts like this. So ERG leaders who aren't in the accounting field, just make sure you have a good treasurer who is well-grounded in the finance organization and have them put this together for you and show you. That way you've got somebody who's helping you make better decisions about how you're investing your dollars and your time.
There's some great ERG management software out there. Fair transparency, I advise one of them, Jesse, so I mention them a lot, but there are others out there that will do this in a system and support it. And so that way there's going to be a dashboard that tells you this automatically, but those ERG leads can still help put that information in. And then tracking by line item and pivot table, what the item is, which ERG, which pillar, and how much of the spend. Again, you can still have a pivot table that shows all of these things as well. But that way you can keep an eye on what's going on. And especially if you don't have a DEI manager and you just have the ERG leads or an ERG program manager, it's just one place for all, one ring to rule them all kind of thing, one dashboard to rule them all. So jumping into ERG lead compensation words. If you have ERGs, you should pay them, pay your leads. Even if it's something small, even if you're just starting out with like $250 quarterly per lead, start somewhere, get it as a line item. This should not go under an HR or DEI budget. It should be it should go in an HR or DEI budget. It should not go into the ERG budget. Oftentimes ERG leads will be said, hey, you have $10,000, but you can use some of this to pay yourself. And that's not fair at all to anybody involved. So being very explicit, we are, a line item for ERG compensation. I have here a little chart. Again, I love showing the actual cost. So if you have 1 lead, 3 lead, or 12 leads, and I was making this as if there were 3 leads per ERG. Let's say you have 4 ERGs with 12 leads, 60 hours a week, assuming they're spending 5 hours a week on their ERG, 2,700 hours a year. That's if you're paying them $15 an hour. And I'm assuming in here that you're not paying them for 6 weeks because of vacation, because everybody should take vacation and 6 weeks is better than 4 weeks. That's $41,000. That is a third of the salary of one software engineer. And that's really 128 is actually a very, very low number for a software engineer. So when you're thinking about 12 ERG leads getting $40,000 a year extra in compensation for doing work that impacts your entire organization, this should be the barest of minimums. And I would suggest, even if you're doing the math out as an hourly rate, do not ask them to track it. It's a cluster to ask them to track it. You can ask estimates and ideas or say, please don't commit over 5 hours a week. But actually tracking it is just going to be a headache. So I would just say, figure out your lump sum and okay, we're going to assume they do 5 hours a week, which means this. I do a quarterly payout. I recommend doing a quarterly payout because folks leave. There's burnout, especially right now. There's situations that arise and you want to make sure people get paid for the work they're doing. So paying it quarterly, most companies will have bonuses paid out quarterly or other things that are happening quarterly. So your finance team shouldn't be too miffed when you ask to involve this. But this allows people to have a little bit more flexibility and also get money then. If somebody does work, they get paid 2 weeks later, and so this you're delaying the payment out a little bit. But again, Adding a $10,000 payment quarterly to a budget where most likely your CEO is getting $1 million in a bonus shouldn't break the bank. This shouldn't, I know it is a tough discussion and I know it is a tough argument, but it should not be. And so by breaking down this math for your leaders, if you're looking to pay folks, and again, the report, last year's report and this year's report focus heavily on compensation specifically, it shouldn't be a question of if, it should be a question of how much. And a lot of people get stuck on, well, how many hours? Are we asking the track hours? Da, 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 da. Make a number and do it. It will impact, they will be positive. Burnout, you know, people will still be burned out, but they'll be getting paid. So they'll be able to go to a spa and get a massage or whatever they need to do. It matters. Maybe you have two different compensation levels based on if it's community driven or goal driven or active or community driven. Totally fine. Because you can say our expectations are, or maybe you realign expectations. And if they have more than 5 goals, you're paying them according to chart 1. And if they have only 2 goals, you're paying them according to chart 2. Totally fine. Have those ranges, keep it consistent, keep it clear, and share it. If you're paying leads, it should be very clear how much extra they're making or why, or all of these things. All of that should be in that charter.
Now, Jess, I know from talking to you in the past that you have a favorite saying that is cash is king. And I haven't heard you say it yet, but I'm waiting for you to say cash is king.
I'm watching Game of Thrones right now because I never watch it. So I even more, I'm like, it is the Iron Throne. The ERGs have their own little thrones.
Right.
And I'm going to bring up some trends in a second.
Well, what I was going to say real quick before you jump into that, 2 quick things. One is that in some organizations, obviously, this is a big lift psychologically because of the way the organization thinks about this work and where it puts it. One of the things that I've seen some organizations do, however, is that they will provide like some kind of extra training. Like, for example, if you provide an ERG lead with training while they're in that ERG role, that prepares them to take on larger scope later on, because managing is managing, right? And in fact, if you can manage a group of volunteers and get them to rally around different types of efforts, imagine what you can do when you have a bunch of people who report directly to you, right? So if you use this as a training platform and you also provide some kind of extra training, so you're not just throwing people in the deep end of the pool and saying, move your arms and legs, but you're actually teaching them how to swim properly, then there is a monetary value to that. And I think that in some organizations, what they do, which is pretty savvy when they can't immediately jump to a payment system, is they put a number on that because there's a cost attached to doing that kind of training. So they put a number on that and they present that. And obviously, you have to weigh this against what other companies are doing in your space, in your industry. And from your stats, a number of organizations in various industries are starting to pay cash. So if you do that, clearly people talk to each other and they're going to say, hey, I'm doing the same thing they're doing and I'm not getting this. So people in organizations have to be ready to say, well, you know, you're not doing this, but here's the monetary value of what we're giving you. And then maybe later on evolve that somehow toward this, because it is a heavy lift, I know, for a lot of people in different organizations. So I wanted to put that out there.
So cruising through, again, the survey is still open to respondents. You can see this lovely link at the bottom. I'll drop it in the chat. So far, and as of this morning, we are up to 137. So it's already updated. Does your ERG have an annual budget? So you can see, you know, it's actually gone down, and I explained that by saying we have more participants. So initially I only was reaching out to a small network, so that 90% was high because it was a very biased network toward this. Again, 2021 I expanded it more, and then again in 2022 expanded it more. So not all ERGs have an annual budget. Oftentimes they will still have spend, but they don't have a dedicated budget, and that's what this is about: is a dedicated, clear budget. Knows and then unknown. There's also a lot of unknowns, and this is because folks aren't allowing that transparency. If you have an ERG budget, you should let them know it. Let them know what the potential spend is. You know, to go from yes to unknown, there's a huge, huge potential win to bring that unknown into the yes. Lead compensation, again, you can see it's increasing from 6 to 10 to 19%. And also on the other forms, so cash is king. Cash matters. We're in a recession. Cash matters. People can't pay for food with professional development. Cash matters. Professional development is great. Mentorship is great. Other pieces, swag, cool. Doesn't put food on the table. It doesn't pay for a vacation. It doesn't give them that spa relaxation, whatever it is. You know, So really be clear. And if you do pay them in other ways, monetize it so they know what the value of it is. This is valued at $2,000. We're sending you to the certificate program, blah, 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 blah. So engagement, these are from the current survey. So again, they're likely to change. This at 128. Does your ERG have goals as individual groups versus a collective ERG? So the most do. So some in process and some like to, and a couple don't have ERGs. Is software used to help measure ERG impact? Again, I'm biased. I advise a company, love them. They're great, but I think everybody should have access to make sure that you're measuring the impact. So it's a little wobbly in here. Some people want to, some people are trying, but what is the impact? What is the ERG impact on retention? Again, big one on the no, but would like to. It's a real struggle. That's one of the biggest ways you can prove budget is you're saving on retention costs and you're saving on recruitment costs and you're saving on training costs is to allocate that savings. Even though it's not realized, allocate that savings toward ERGs.
That's especially good information for today, because right now organizations have been bleeding talent left and right, and there's a lot of money being pumped in TA into helping them to get talent. And a lot of organizations are waking up and realizing that not only do they want to pump money into TA, but they want to pump money into retention as well, so they don't have to pump so much money into TA.
Yep. And then is ERG leadership considered during performance review? I was actually shocked that 30% said yes and 16% in process. Yeah, you have to. You have to. Period. End of story. If you have ERG leads, make sure that they are some piece of their ERG leadership is assessed in their performance review. And I would say the same for executive sponsors. If you have an executive sponsor's ERG, they should get feedback based on their constituents.
Yeah, and usually a good place to do that is in their developmental plan.
Right. So this is really small text. I apologize, but I wanted to make sure that all of these were on here. Is what are the two most important factors to C-suite when it comes to ERGs? And I'm leaning in close because I can't read because eyes. So the biggest one obviously is to create community internally at the organization, which impacts retention. And the third one, let's see, leadership. So the next one down is general employee participation in at least one ERG, help improve product technology services, host educational events was the third most popular category. Identifier / in-group folks participate in ERGs, increasing representation or historically underrepresented folks, mentorship, partner with external vendors, support recruitment efforts, and then support recruitment efforts specifically of those who are underrepresented. And then the big one next, second most popular is it's unclear what C-suite prioritizes. By having those sponsors work with those ERGs to set clear goals, C-suite can then say, based on these goals, we are prioritizing X for our ERGs. So you can work backwards. The C-suite doesn't necessarily have to, or vice versa. If C-suite says this is our priority, trickle it down versus trickling it up. But again, announce it in a town hall, put it in your intranet, update, whatever, use it in your software, make it clear. It'll increase retention. And you got to start trying to measure that. And specifically looking at retention of people of color or underrepresented groups versus not. And then what ERGs do you currently have in your organization? And this was a select all that apply, and there was a number of others. It ranges. Again, I specifically identify mine, or I consider an ERG as identity based. So something that you can't choose. So a lot of folks might have a religion one. I actually don't have that, but if it's ethnicity, like I'm Jewish, yes, but not Judaism. So there's some fine lines. And veteran / military spouses is the only one in there that I think is different, but that is a very specific genre of human being. And mental health is in there. Again, mental health for me walks a fine line. But just you can see there's a ton of different types out there. And then please participate and share with your networks. If you go to this link, it's a very short link. You can do it on your phone. You can do it on your computer. You can do it on your tablet. Anybody here and anybody you pass it along to, if they say, hey, I filled out your survey, we will offer 10% off any lunch and learn for your organization, which they are normally $2,200. So it's a $220 savings, which is pretty awesome. The more people that participate, the better the data. And again, it's going to be shared for everybody freely. I write a big report on it. So this isn't just like, here's some fun data. It is a report. Multiple people have told me that they've used the report to get compensation or get budget allocated or get clarity from their C-suite because somebody is writing about it. So bring me your data, bring me your friends' data. Please, please, please.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jess. Jess actually updated the data right before we got on this. So this is fresh data. I was telling you, we should have a breaking news logo coming across the screen. So thanks again, Jess. Let me pause the recording.